Morning. This is Sunday, June 23rd. I am Jack. We have no participants today. Some are on vacation, some are traveling, some had other meetings, etc. And I've been doing what I can to narrow the conversation down to people with a sincere enough interest to actually look at what we're talking about as honestly as possible, to offer the audience a chance to actually investigate in their own listening the concepts that are being presented here. And so today the conversation is going to be between you and I, the discussion. And I know if you're listening to this, you're there. Wherever you are right now, I don't need the details to know that when you're listening, you're exactly where you are. And the point of this is that we can have a discussion and you can consider ideas. You don't have to go public with any ideas you may have about your mental problem if you struggle with mental anxiety and emotional turmoil and inner conflict. If those things are something that you deal with on a regular basis and you look for relief in those things, you don't need to talk about them publicly to begin to address them in a collected manner. And my, I guess, hope would be in this case that the conversation we're able to have between you and I includes the responses and the reactions that are natural to you in regard to the way you think and how you think, so that nothing I say can do for you what you ultimately do with what you hear and how you listen to it. Those choices are fully yours, 100%. Each of us seems to have that option as to how we think, what we choose to think, etc. And as a result, how we act on that thinking. That seems to be the freedom we have. Now, with that freedom comes responsibility. And responsibility is the ability to respond. If I am on a daily basis trying constantly to feel better about things that I'm doing that are wrong and not thinking of them as natural, thinking of those things I'm trying to feel better than or get over them as natural to my human experience, and thinking there's nothing I have to do with them, that I haven't done them, that I'm not causing them. And so I'm constantly thinking my job is to feel better than them, come up with a new method, a new application, a new self-help to help the self that seems to always be in this constant, interminable struggle. My years in sobriety, and originally in sobriety, it took me years to get sober. And during those years, I did everything I could to convince people and help them understand that I didn't have a problem and I shouldn't be subject to the rigors of what sobriety requires, which is honesty and acceptance and willingness and the idea of accountability and responsibility effectively. And so during those years, I struggled and continued to struggle and continued to drink and continued to use and continued to feel conflicted and continued to have a miserable experience that I constantly thought I needed to feel better than. And once I realized that, and literally only suggested, literally the thought popped into my head that if what I'd been hearing was correct and it was a disease and I had it, that I probably wasn't going to get better thinking I didn't, and not just looking into it, starting to do what I could. And one of the things that happened immediately when I had that thought that maybe I have this disease, and if I have this disease, I'm not going to talk my way out of it, is I immediately had the clarity to pick up the phone and call somebody and tell them that I had a problem and I needed help. And I'd never done that in 6 years of coming and going from meetings. So clearly the mental issue that I had was dominant, primary, to the compulsions that I had. And the book eventually, in my process of reading it, revealed that to me. So after getting sober and having the freedom, I'd never had the freedom from drinking and using until that day. And I really understood what the difference was between a dry drunk and an attempt to get sober and an attempt to stay sober and an attempt to constantly fight against sobriety and be actually free of the obsession to drink and use. I knew that day I would get a year. I'd never gotten that in all those days that I'd spent in different lengths of sobriety prior to that, 30, 60, 90, 120, 6 months, 9 months, got as far as a year, 11 and a half months, and I went out. I kept trying to prove that if I got a little more time, that meant I didn't have a problem. Clearly, I didn't have a problem if I could get 60 days after I'd only ever gotten 30 days before. So that line of thinking was pervasive, and as the book says, the underlying disease is a mental problem. It's not the bottle, it's not alcohol, it's not marijuana, it's not food, it's not sex, it's not gambling, it's not all of those compulsive behaviors, it's not all those symptoms. Every symptom is attached to some disease. And in addiction, the disease is a mental obsession. The idea that if I think about something longer and harder, I'm going to make that thing work. And the problem is the only things I have to think about harder and longer are things that won't work. Because in actual reality, not the reality I impose in my thinking by imagining, what I'm doing is in fact going to someday pay off and not notice that it isn't paying off now. And the chances are it may never pay off because it has no connection to reality. There's no substance in the thought. So if I'm operating on that basis and not noticing that things that are actually aligned with reality, I don't have to think of too much at all to apply myself in that direction. If once I admitted that I was honestly, simply imagining that maybe I had a problem, that simple imagination, that simple willingness to simply imagine, which was consideration, that maybe this thing is something I had, and that's what was the thought that I had, gave me the clarity, not because I hadn't had it all along, but because I was starting to talk about it and think about it in relation to what I actually had rather than what I thought I had. And that's a distinction I would suggest between a being knowing nature, which would be spiritual in nature according to the terms that we use, and a human functional nature, which would be relative according to the comings and goings and the relations that we're in terms of our own thinking about our thinking, from that seemingly private enterprise that we engage in, to all of the relationships we have with everything. Money, sex, kids, children, all of it, everything, everyone. And in seeing those distinctions, it became clear to me that the book was talking about something. The book was helping me to unravel the lies I told and continue to maintain, hoping someday they would become true and prove that I was in fact the dominant creature on the planet. I was the winner. I was the one that everybody should listen to. So when I'm talking about what I'm talking about here, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. If the premise of my existence is the premise of existence, then it is the premise of your existence. And it is something we already share. And we don't need to define it any more than that to think of it in general enough terms to realize that if it's true for you, and it's true for me, it's true for everything and everyone, everyone, not just what I'm saying, not just what you're thinking, but in relation to thinking clearly about this, that clarity would introduce us to something that we all share rather than something we each have separately. And my experience is I get a lot of people come talk to me and they start with telling me about their own reality and their own truth. And it isn't uncommon that thinking about thinking presumes that whatever we come to a conclusion of becomes our reality, as though reality could be separate for us than everyone else and still be real. The Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, spirituality in general, looks at absolute natures, meaning something that is indivisible, indistinguishable because there are no parts and pieces, seamless, whole, complete, absolute in every respect all the time. And if that absolute nature exists, and one way to confirm whether something exists, just like one way to confirm whether or not my thought is real and right, is to apply it, consider it, and see what happens. What happened for me when I had that thought that I might have this problem is all of a sudden I had the clarity to mention I had a problem and ask for help. Two pretty fundamental things to the process of getting sober and recovery. So if that's the point with respect to alcohol and drugs and whatever else I was doing that was compulsive, wouldn't that also be the same point to the thinking we do? The point is, if I'm looking at it clearly, I start to see it as something not that is happening to me, but something that is being done by me, something I am creating, an effect I'm creating, because I am thinking, my thinking about what I'm thinking is the cause of that effect. So if that's the case and we share that, I can't tell you how to think of this. to have you see that, because the freedom we have, free will that we have, apparently, we are freed enough to seemingly think whatever we want, wherever we are, whenever we are thinking. And if you doubt that, start just trying out any thought you come up with, any crazy thought, and see if you aren't, in fact, considering that thought. We're pretty free to do that. So if I'm free to do that, you are free to do that. And that ability to value that freedom, to be response-able for that freedom, to have the ability to respond to that freedom, rather than react to that freedom obsessively defending something, would provide some degree of confirmation and clarity. Now, part of the clarity I got when I got sober originally was not immediately understanding everything I needed to do. It was actually a clarity that there was something seriously wrong in my experience, that it had been wrong ever since I was 3 or 4 years old. It was not new. And yet it was new. It was new in the sense that the moment was new, and the moment was where I was reckoning with that seeming history, but that history was really no more than I was thinking about it in the present. I began to realize the present is where the solution is. Why? Because it's the only place where anything ever happens. So in some of this, it may seem preposterously simple, but if you apply it and try it, you may find that it shifts the instability of your thinking to a more stable basis. Now, the other side of it, just like I was just heading toward, is that once my windshield was clear and I started noticing the mental problem, I started noticing how significant that mental problem had been. It didn't all of a sudden become so crystal clear like the obsession to drink and use, because drinking and using was a small part of this greater sick thinking I was doing that had been interacting with everything and everyone, not just alcohol and drugs. I'd been reacting and interreacting with people as long as I had been maintaining these thoughts, which I would suggest created the misery, created the depression, created the sense at 13 or 14 that I needed something else, and all of a sudden found that something else in 2 8-ounce glasses of whiskey, 1 scotch, 1 bourbon. So if I went that far and took that long and felt so bad, why wouldn't the first drink give me some sense of relief? And if I didn't feel that bad and I hadn't been doing that thing prior to that drink, there would be no relief from that drink. I would have felt probably what I felt. The book says we don't particularly like the taste, we like the effect. What's the effect? I feel better. So if I tasted it and drank it and felt sick from it, I probably would have said, that tastes horrible, I'm sick, I'm never doing that again. But being irresponsible in my thinking to imagine that I was not the center and cause of the thinking that was causing the depression, when I felt better, I thought that effect was the solution. So now what am I claiming? But the effect is the cause. That all I need to do is treat the cause while I'm actually ignoring the thinking. In sobriety, there is a lot of discussion about acting contrarily. Take contrary action. Well, we wouldn't take contrary action if we weren't thinking contrarily to begin with. And to dismiss the idea that thinking has nothing to do with sobriety, which I hear a lot, is to dismiss what Bill Wilson talked about thinking and the insight that he talked about when it came to understanding. And understanding is based on thinking and reason. Misunderstanding is based on thoughtlessness and irrationality. That's how misunderstanding develops. It isn't to say we can't misunderstand, but when we misunderstand and think it's understanding, maybe you can see that conflict, that internal conflict that comes up. And the longer I maintain it, the longer I feel bad about it, because it wears on my body and my body gets worse. And I know it's getting worse because I'm feeling worse. I'm feeling bad. I'm feeling disconnected. I'm feeling actually the lack of substance in the thinking that I'm doing. Sense of disconnect isn't possible within an absolute nature. It's impossible. We can't be apart from what we're a part of. It's impossible. We can't be alone. We can think we're alone, we can feel alone. My experience is when I'm feeling alone, I am feeling lonely thoughts because they have no substance and I'm thinking of them as reality. So if the clarity that comes from the admission, honestly, of what's happening, I can't tell you how to think those things to have that clarity. That's really your job. You're not only your job, you're right. You're absolute right to make those choices and try those things on and think of everything I'm saying as preposterous and then wonder if it isn't maybe worth trying, maybe just worth considering a little deeper than the initial thought that it's just stupid and simple. It can't be possible. Written history has been very, very clear about the fact that humans have used righteous indignation to justify suppressing, oppressing, and killing other people. Not because of their size or their shape or their color, but because of their thinking. It always comes down to a thought. And in my experience, when I thought thinking about my thinking was creating reality, I then thought immediately I became my thinking. And then wondered why I felt disconnected and had to get to work to try to reconnect myself all the time, to try to do all sorts of things to get better. If I weren't doing the thing that was making it worse, I wouldn't have the impulse to try to get better. I wouldn't feel that all the time, that chronic addictive behavior. Addiction is not a healthy form of mentality. It's a sick form of mentality. It's diseased, which is why the addiction was eventually, and alcoholism was eventually designated as a disease, because the dis-ease of that thinking is uncomfortable and it's distorted and it's disproportional. When I all of a sudden make believe that simply because I can think about my thinking and come to a conclusion that I'm the creator of reality and then become only what I think, I feel less than naturally because I've taken everything, the absolute nature of everything, and dismissed it in the name of thinking I am that thing. And I know better, or I wouldn't feel less than. It's automatic. We know more than we think when all we think is only what we think we know. It's just a fact. And the knowingness, which we've talked recently, Gabe has talked about it, and if you listen to some of the prior episodes, when I think I'm my thinking, and you hear other people talk about this, so I'm not trying to invalidate my experience or validate theirs, but share that this may be common between us. When I think I am my thinking, I literally think I'm in my thinking, and I think thus I have no perspective on anything else going on, so I don't know how I'm in it, and I don't know how to get out of it. Neither of those things are true. Because if a lie is a lie and I'm basing my first thought on a lie and I continue, I'm going to perpetuate new mythology. And we have done that through humanity, through human written record, through mythology and superstition and all sorts of theories today about mentality. And I would suggest, first of all, I'm not a doctor. This is not a scientific thesis of any sort. It's simply experientially based. But today we have mounting evidence of disorders, new disorders being identified all the time. And if you think about thinking out of order, meaning thinking's my reality, not reality, it means that I have now dismissed reality as being real and only taken on what I think about it as being the reality. That would be out of order. If reality is always reality, that would be primary to our experience and our existence. And thinking would be subsequent to that. My thinking didn't start until I got a body. The nature of the universe started billions of years before that. So clearly, I was not the thinker of reality to think of the universe and all things real. I had my human experience begin, which is where my thinking began. And it didn't occur immediately. It took some time. So if I was developing my thinking on the heels of all other thinkers, which would be true for all of us in the evolution, the process of our existence, and we've been collecting ideas about how we think about our thinking as being reality, then there would be some evidence in history of a breakdown of the survival instinct, the instinct to want to survive and to help and be cooperative and to engage with others in the best way, rather than in some divisive, controlled, authoritarian, dictatorial, suppressive, oppressive way. And you go through written history, you see that simple thoughts, like the idea that we were no longer center of the universe, had people burned at the stake. because of the thought. Why? Because there were groups of people who thought they were in charge. They thought they controlled spirituality. They thought they controlled reality. And they said we were at the center of the universe. So when somebody said they weren't, they were afraid of the thought because it undermined their whole claim that they had both the right and the reality of existence on their side. When in fact, if reality and existence are on anyone's side, it's on all sides. Anything that exists would be included in that equitably, indiscriminately, indivisibly. And those transitions are obvious throughout history. So when I learned about this, started noticing this, it also occurred to me that when I am thinking obsessively, I become very, very concerned about what other people are thinking about. I become very sensitive. And I not only become sensitive, I begin to suspect I know what they're thinking. And whatever I think I know they're thinking does not tend to be very complementary to the ideas I have about who I am. Because any variation in that vulnerable, weak idea I have about my life and myself, any variation becomes a threat. Because it doesn't align with my idea about reality, with my seeming reality, my seeming truth. And I can't have truth and I can't have reality if it's mine and not everyone else's. If we're talking about it honestly, if we're talking about it actually, reality is all encompassing of all things that exist. Everything exists, not just you and me and I and all these opinions we have about people, but all things, everything. What we call inanimate objects are based on the exact same platform. It may vary in terms of how they express it, but the essence of it is the same. If anything's if there's any essence, it must be essential. So if this has any basis, it is the basis you have right now where you are as you are, nothing more or less than that. And when I saw this most clearly, I had a panic attack. And it came out of an experience of writing about ego and beginning to develop this on paper, because I found when I wrote, it helped me clarify ideas and helped me see where they were wonky and lengthy and complicated. And I began to realize that nothing real and true is complicated at all. It's extremely simple. So it tends to get very narrowed down. And yet when you're dealing with something like reactive thinking, which is effectively what obsessive thinking is, it's a reaction to a reaction to a reaction, because it's defending against something that's impossible to defend against. So it constantly needs to be I need to be on guard about that thinking 24 hours a day. And when I saw that, my body turned gray. I felt all the fear that had accumulated in my system, and my body turned gray. And it was 5:30 in a coffee shop in El Segundo, and I stood up and just walked out, left all my stuff sitting there in my laptop and all the things I would normally be concerned about, and just walked out the door to get air and take a deep breath. And a woman coming toward me almost dropped because she could see that something was seriously wrong. I thought I was dying. That's how it felt. But what in fact was dying was the collection of fear I'd been maintaining, because I was writing about ego, and I said, simple thought, I'm continuing to define something that is absolutely make-believe, fantasy acting as reality, illusion considered to be reality, was delusional, and here I'm defining it. And it hit me. The only thing I was defining was the thought I was having about it presently, now, as though it existed, and as though I needed to map it out and further define it, when in fact the definition I was giving to it was further defining a narrative about something that isn't a fantasy that had no basis in reality. And it took me hours to overcome that, hours that day to feel okay for a second. I started to drive home eventually an hour or so later, and I had to pull over on the highway. I just couldn't, I wasn't functional, because so much of the defensiveness, so much of the defensivity in my body had just melted. And what I was being exposed to was not immediately the peace and the quiet, but actually the collection of lies and experiences. And sort of like people talk about their life passing before them and when they die, my sense is what we're talking about in terms of that death is the death of something that never even has lived. It's all been imagined in terms of ego. Thinking about thinking itself, we have presumed becomes ourself. And it isn't. It's just more thinking, which is what obsessive thinking is. When I think about my thinking as though it's reality, since it isn't reality, I need to constantly focus more and more and more and more attention on it. So what I'm really doing is attending to it as though I'm going to make it into reality. And since it's never reality, I need to keep thinking about it more and more and more to try to get it there. It's exactly what I did with drinking. When I thought I could control and enjoy my drinking, I drank out of control to prove I was in control. And I mean out of control, completely out of control. 6, 8 Long Island iced teas, a case of beer, a bottle of tequila. Whatever I could do, I was trying to prove that I was right about what was wrong. If that's the mental issue, the mental problem, that problem does not go away when I recover from alcoholism because alcohol is a symbol and marijuana was a symptom. All those things I was doing, I was trying to use to feel better about what I knew was wrong or I wouldn't have been suffering from it. I had an awareness it was wrong. I just didn't want to admit it because it would undermine. Same thing, I didn't want other people to think differently about what I was thinking. I was trying to maintain the thinking too chronically all the time, all the time, all the time, all the time, thinking someday it would prove itself to be real and right. And all of a sudden I would overcome all that stuff that was going on because I would be proved to be the victor. I would be proved to be the creator of reality. And what would that do but separate me from everyone else anyhow? And so that sense of isolation, that sense of being alone became obvious. I was simply creating an environment that caused that. It wasn't happening to me and it wasn't happening by anything outside of me. There was no curse. It was not an accident. It was a deliberate attempt to make believe I could create my own reality on the basis of thinking that my thinking was all my only source in the universe, that all I needed to do was think about it longer, and eventually I'd come to the solution. So thinking is not the problem. Obsessive thinking is simply a misuse of thinking. It's a mistaken identity of who we are, which I would say defines ego. Now, interestingly, in ego by definition is I. We call it the self. But we've interpreted the self to be somewhat distinct from us because we talk about I am thinking to myself. I am thinking of myself. I am talking to myself. So if we didn't think of it as separate, I would simply say, I am talking. I am thinking. But we don't talk about it in those terms. We have self-help, which is actually helping ourselves to the idea that this self we have in thought that is really just thinking about itself, that we've determined is ourself, that we're going to get it better someday. The more attention I focus on it, we're going to make it better. We're going to get healthier. Today, even with the advent of Alcoholics Anonymous, which was a revolution in many respects to recovery from alcoholism, the idea that it was a disease, the idea that it was an allergy, the idea that it was an abnormal response to something. What's the abnormal response? I keep doing the thing that's killing me over and over and over again in the name of thinking and saving me. With all of that understanding now, 85 years old, or almost 90 years old, I believe, 2025 will be 90 years. With all that understanding, all that new understanding, addiction today is an all-time high, as is alcoholism, apparently, and suicide. And to drink for us, alcoholics, is suicide. It says it in the book. To drink for us is to die. All of these obsessive thoughts are immediately creating impulsive and compulsive behaviors. None of them are healthy, not one of them. All of them in some way are killing us. Stress and anxiety today is recognized as part of a complement to every physical disease. If I'm anxious, if I'm nervous, I'm undermining my entire bodily system to maintain homeostasis, which is an attempt to maintain stability in the body. There's always bacteria and germs and cancers and things that are introduced into our systems. Being sick is having that thing in our system overwhelm and overrun the ability of our body to maintain stability. Sounds a lot like mental instability and mental stability to me. If I introduce thoughts that have no basis and immediately react to them because they need a defense to maintain them as anything that seems to exist, and then I react to the reaction, I'm literally creating a critical reaction, like a critical mass that is explosive. I'm building up charge. Charge creates pressure. Pressure creates stress. Stress creates anxiety, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of a sudden, my body's inflamed. I'm constricting my body and its ability to function. What happens? It gets inflamed. The opposite happens. And something that's become apparent is that opposites are not opposite within the realm of our experience. Because if the absolute is absolute, if there's an infinite source, as the book says, unlimited, then somehow all these things that seem to be separate are not separate at all. And one of the things that the old philosophers discovered was that everything is always changing. The one thing that isn't changing is that everything is changing. What's interesting about that in relation to the program of Alcoholics Anonymous is that the traditions were started by Bill well after the steps to help neutralize all the typical effects that occur within an organization and when people get together to organize themselves that typically help that organization fall apart and become disorganized. And what was the steps about? Unity, coming together, having a common purpose. Being anonymous. What's anonymity? It's not just hiding out and saying only my first name. It's actually to pretend that I'm being hidden from the stigma of alcoholism. In the beginning, that can be very helpful, but that's not the essence of anonymity. Anonymity is a faceless essence. It isn't a personality. It isn't a characterization. It's an absolute essence that we all share that's faceless. That's why it's the fundamental basis of the principles or the traditions. So that freedom, if we share it, would probably be worth mentioning and talking about and beginning to see as something that we have been thinking about incorrectly. And as a result, thinking of something we need to find. Humans have been seeking through history to find something that apparently has never been found because they're still looking. And the hardest place to find is the place you're in, where you are right now, if you think you're not there. And if you think you're not there, you're going to create a disturbance because you know better. You couldn't be there thinking you weren't there if you weren't there. You know better. You have a knowing sense that isn't always contained within your thinking. Thinking is a human sense. This knowing sense is something that I would suggest transcends time and space and isn't within time and space. We call it metaphysical, but even that suggests it's beyond time and space, as though it would be somewhere else and not here. And if this essence is essential, it would always be where we are, always in reach, always as we are, not something to get to. The idea that I have to get to it is the idea that it isn't here. If it's here and it's absolute and it's impossible not to be everywhere at all times and everything beyond everywhere because it's not even in time and space. It's a dynamic that is very even hard to comprehend. And yet if it's available, it would always be where we are, which is always in the present where we always are. And we don't have to think we're in the present to be in the present. And I would suggest that to think we're not in the present, we're always present, thinking we're not present. We have created all sorts of mythologies and ideas about how to get someplace we've always been. And as a result, they're all twisted. They're all illogical. They never seem to work. They always seem to take and require more and more and more and more effort to get there and have it finally done. So one of the things Bill Wilson talked about was creating a God of your own understanding. That whole concept came at a last minute before the publication of the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. It came at the last minute, introduced by somebody who was trying to overcome a psychiatrist who kept saying, you're talking too much about God, you're going to scare people away. God can be so reactive to people and you're going to lose the audience you're trying to engage. And so his suggestion was, why don't we just call it a God of our own understanding? Which he went ahead and did. And that became a pivotal aspect of sobriety. But Bill didn't say, come up with a God of your understanding and stick with it. You hear people say, that's my story and I'm sticking with it. Well, if that's your story and you're sticking with it, you're doing your best to maintain it as your story. Well, if who you are as a story, that isn't who you are. That's something you're making up in thought. That's a narrative that's being created about you. That's exactly what ego and self-centeredness is about. So if we're not in the story, and we're always where we are, we know we're where we're always. The idea that I can take my attention away from what's happening and think I'm not in reality anymore because I'm distracting my attention is one more example of how we think thinking is reality. To think my thinking removed from what's happening and I start paying attention to things that aren't happening, which is largely what obsessive thinking is, paying attention to things that aren't happening in the name of thinking I need to secure myself by thinking about them more and more and more and trying to figure them out, when in fact it's the figuring out that I'm doing in the present that's keeping me from noticing what is happening and paying attention to what is happening that's actually causing the threat, that's giving me the impression that I need to fix it. Now, that may take a second to consider and contemplate, but if you can get anything out of that, just begin to realize, if you're interested, that we go to great lengths to create an experience that seems to be something we have nothing to do with, and as a result, seems to be happening to us, and as a result, seems as though there's nothing we can do about it. And it's all being caused within the clever ability we have to imagine, but now imagination, which is one of our greatest assets, to begin to imagine things as inspired as they are possible, is now turned into a liability where we're imagining things that are not inspired and impossible. We can do that, and you can become familiar with that. You can begin to notice that you have been very busy, just like I have and still am to some in any degree, that I maintain thoughts that aren't true and think they're true, wrong thoughts and think they're true and they're going to come true. And someday, if I just push harder, I'll get there. And all of a sudden feel suspect of everything around me. It's not the everything around me I'm suspect of, it's the immediacy of the condition I'm creating that I'm suspect of. And again, thinking I'm in it, don't think I have anything to do with it. So it must be everything and everyone else. This goes on during sobriety. I've worked with enough people. I've listened to the stories. I've listened to how they come in. Nobody has ever come to me and said, please help me feel worse and think more negative thoughts. It's never that way. Everybody always wants to feel better. They want to find their true self. And my first comment to them is stop looking. To look is to claim it isn't here, but to actually look clearly, to seek as though it's not here is to say it's not here, but to look clearly is to see it's absolute can't. Or how would it be anywhere else if it's true? It's by thinking about it that I've been struggling with. My ideas I've been utilizing and reutilizing and trying to dominate and master. So I'm going to also mention that this whole idea of thinking ourself is thinking about thinking itself, and that becomes ourself. Think of what happens when we do that. Just take a little mental vacation. If I think all I am is what I think, and I need to constantly think about that self I think I am, I become the dictator of those thoughts. I become the manic maintainer, like the master, and yet feel like a slave to these thoughts, feel like I'm stuck in those thoughts. You say it, you hear it. I feel like I'm stuck in my thoughts. My head, my thoughts are intrusive. My thoughts are attacking me. These are things that thoughts cannot do. They are opinions we can have, and they are effects we can create. Because when I say I'm not doing what I'm doing, if I'm hammering my hand with a hammer, I would then think the hammer is hammering my hand, and I've got a problem. I got to stop the hammer. But if I notice I'm the one doing it, I can quickly say, why would I do that? So the steps lead to a spiritual awakening. If we are in fact awake, certainly we would not be sleeping. And when I am sleeping and having a dream, I think I'm in the dream. So what's happening appears to be happening to me. Not a coincidence that this lines up with this thinking. I'm in a dream, and that dream turns to a nightmare, and those things that aren't even really happening seem to be all that's happening, and all of a sudden I'm filled with fear. So what happens? I wake up. What happens when I wake up? Say, oh, it's a dream. It was only a dream. What a relief. I may still feel the roots of that terror. I may still feel the roots of that experience. But interestingly, with dreams, they dissipate very quickly. And very often in my experience, some of the best dreams I have, I wake up from. Some of them I remember vividly for a while, but they very quickly fade in all the detail, all the enormity of the capacity my brain has to develop stories and narratives and imagery. Once I'm in the face of everything that's happening. So when I wake up and look around, it's pretty astonishing that there is a lot going on. As a matter of fact, there's everything going on that can be going on. It's happening right now. So this idea about being desensitized and the idea about dumbing my experience down so that I can claim I'm only this little thing, and now I'm defending this little thing as though it's all there is, doesn't eliminate my greater knowing awareness of what's happening. It actually helps me begin to realize and try this on again. Think of it like a pair of shoes you're trying to figure out. They fit in the store, but when you walk in them for any length of time, you know whether they really fit. So if you try these ideas on, since it's really your prerogative to think what you want and how you want, which also comes, by the way, with the fact that you are thinking what you want and how the effects you're creating are what you want too. And that may sound sick and impossible, but sick thinking has everything look backward. Because addiction's the idea that a lie is based on the idea that it's true. A lie is not a lie when it's a lie. A lie is true. When a lie is thought only to be true, that's what creates a lie. It's something false looking as though it's true. So if I'm causing this in my thinking about my thinking and thinking my thinking is my only source and I need to think more about it and get it straightened out, I'm never going to straighten out because there's nothing to straighten out. It's all fantasy. It's all delusional. It is insanity. But it's induced insanity. It's induced by the steps I'm taking to induce it, by the thinking I'm doing to induce it. Thinking a wrong thought will someday be right. Well, how can I get out of this? How can I stop this? Normally the plea. It's not about stopping it, it's about noticing we're the ones starting it. Just like picking up the first drink is the one that leads to the second. It doesn't come from stopping the ninth drink, it comes from not starting the first drink. And it's the same with thinking. Because a cause always precedes an effect. So how do I know I'm doing this? Look at the effects you're suffering. Look at the effects you're experiencing. Start to notice the effects. We've been talking recently, Gabe has brought this up, about feeling when he's in it, he doesn't even know he's in it. He can't understand what's happening, etc. With the opposites that we started talking about earlier, if cause is caused and effect is effect, they're connected. Common ground between them connects them. That's why opposites attract within our experience, the relative experience. There's levels in the universe where that apparently doesn't happen, but for us, that seems to happen. So I can take extreme positions, but those extreme positions don't mean there's no other position to take. It means that I'm pushing to be further and further away from that other thing, thinking I can escape it, while in fact I'm just creating more and more tension and wondering why I kind of get slammed back into it at some point. And I say kind of because it's just an experience. It's like I'm running from something, thinking I'll get away from it, but I'm on a bungee cord, and eventually the tension just pulls me back. And I'm asking, how do I keep getting it? How do I keep getting it? So the idea of opposites, when you begin to understand that they're absolutely connected, they're unified, everything is already connected. So when I take a position, an extreme position, and think it's right, as though it's the only position, I'm creating antagonism with everything and everyone else, everything. Because every other position becomes something that's a threat to my position. So those are dispositions I take. And impositions I take. And impositions held too long or held for any length of time become depressing because the imposition adds up. it begins to chronically weigh on our body because our body knows something's wrong. It's bearing that weight. Whereas normally it would be free to function without interference, without obstruction. And the obstruction isn't a real obstruction, it's simply a mental obstruction that we've created. It's not a real obstacle to reality and truth and God and love and spirituality and the infinite nature of things. It's a mental obstruction. All we're doing is crippling our own mental capacity to function to our full capacity. And to function literally, meaning we're reading the body language accurately, rather than seeing a disturbance as something to run from, which is why it's being created to begin with. We're trying to divest our responsibility for it. So we end up thinking getting further from it will work. Humans have been trying this forever. It hasn't worked. It's not going to work. Every major transition in thought, and I would say that the movement of religions, if you've studied at all about where the Washingtonians and the Oxford group came from, it was a movement of pastors and priests and others in churches saying, why do we hate each other? We're all Christians. Why do we hate each other? Why do we fight each other? And a couple of them said, we just want to start helping people. We're going to start there. Forget about all the rest of these ideas we have, of the divisive ideas about the type of religion we have, and the style and the shape of the cross and all the different things that we were using. And out of that came Salvation Army and the Red Cross, still in existence today. Salvation Army is one of the highest rated recovery services, and they're almost free. They take people of all ilks who are sincerely interested. They do not let them walk in the door to contaminate their process. They make sure these people are ready to face what they need to do what they have to become healthy again, to actually do the work. And they're all working on the same basis. Ex-CEOs, gang members, they're all working around the same tables to begin with. And they run those distribution centers with the clothes that come in to make the money that feeds them all. But they run the whole thing to become accountable, to become responsible, not to become responsible, but to act responsibly. Because I would suggest that the nature of responsibility is our nature, naturally. We exist, we have all the faculties to succeed. Some people may not, but that means when any of us have a little bit more, we can make up for that person who doesn't. And I'm not talking about helping people get worse by giving them more for doing more wrong, which has become so popular as to be its own pandemic. I'm talking about actually helping people who are interested in helping themselves and seeing how quickly they get up on their feet and how quickly they are able to help well beyond what they need for themselves, for their families, and it grows outward from there. If this line of thinking has been thought of incorrectly as long as it has and seems preposterous to be so simple and so easy to resolve, it doesn't happen because we wonder why everyone else isn't doing it. It happens because we each start to see that it's what we're each doing that's causing it collectively. It's nothing more than that. And that's the responsibility of this idea that we're self-diagnosed in AA and any of the addictive problems. If anybody's telling us we're an addict and get us into treatment, the chances are very slim that there's going to be any success. And I say that from this mental point of view because it's what we each choose. We can dismiss absolutely the best advice we've ever heard and say it has nothing to, that may be good for everybody else, but not me. I know what I'm doing. I know where I'm going. I know what I have. I know who I am. We can dismiss it all as quickly. It's light speed in our thinking. Doesn't mean it's right. And consideration is a contemplative meditation with eyes open. It's starting to see that the ultimate steps are telling us to practice principles in all our affairs because all of our affairs are happening all the time. And the principles aren't something we need to employ, they're something that already employ us. And when I think I need to come to terms with them, once again, I think I'm in control of them. And when I don't come to terms, it's the principle that's the problem rather than my thinking about it that's causing the problem. There's an absolute source, we are never without it. If there are principles, they are never broken. It is the thinking I do about those things that cause the deficiencies, the dysfunctions, the inter-reactive tendencies in my relations that give me the impression that everyone and everyone else is a problem. And it's not a coincidence. We see so clearly what's wrong in the world. while suffering with our own sense of doubt in ourselves or in what we're doing about ourselves. It's not a coincidence. If we are, then we exist. And if we exist on a platform that we share. We're not individuals any more than by appearance. We're experiencing a human experience, which is a life form. It isn't life, it is the chance to have life express its full potential, the capacity of life, the abundant nature of life, the absolute loving, generous, always giving nature of life. We can call it anything we want, it doesn't change it. We can think of it in any way we want, it does not change it. To think of it as something we can manipulate is to think of our experience and our ability as being greater than it, rather than humbly, by the way. Humility is about honesty, it's about letting things be as they are. Noticing that if I'm making more or less out of things or feeling more or less about things, I am not thinking honestly about those things, because honesty is about humility. Humility is about having things the way they are, letting things be. When I'm constantly trying to have them become something, I'm the manipulator of those things. Now, saying that does not mean I cannot think, or should not have desires, or should not have wants, or should not have challenges, or should not have opinions. I can have all those things. But when I start seeing those things as choices I'm making, suffering the consequences of those is not as gravely threatening to my existence, because I realize along the way that I can adapt and adjust as quickly as I am shown that these things are not exactly right. It gives me a chance to begin to actually interact with life's terms. And life's terms are the law and order of nature, whatever that means, in the vastest sense. Where nature, like we think of it in terms of the forests and the trees and the oceans, excuse me, are not there. It's an essence of essence. It isn't in time and space, so it isn't relative. It isn't a thing. It's a knowingness. And I would suggest, as I said earlier, that people seem to think they see their life pass before their eyes before they die. My suspicion is we're doing that in sobriety by beginning to look at the life we led as something that's past, that doesn't have any hold on us, that we don't regret. Because we're looking at it accurately, we're not looking at it as something happening now, we're looking at something that is only a memory. And the sum total of those memories is what I'm thinking right now. The sum total of everything that's happened in the universe is the sum total of this moment right now, this present state that we're in, this present moment that we're in. We all share that equally, equitably, indiscriminately, indistinguishably. It's absolute source, absolutely ours all the time, and everything else too. Think of the things we think of as inanimate and look at how beautiful they cooperate with each other, all the atoms and all the molecular structure, the entire dynamic of what we call this universe. It interreacts and doesn't have its hands on its head with an opinion, pissed off about some cloud doing what that cloud's doing. It works in unison all the time with everything. And certainly there are eruptive things in the universe, but in all those transitions of those eruptions, there is some value coming back into the universe that's feeding the structure of this universe. And I say that because there are challenges in our experience, but we are choosing to look at those challenges either as impossibilities or a chance to grow, a chance to develop. And that's always going to be the case. If I notice that I feel disturbed about something, book says it, whenever we are disturbed, goes on to say, which very often is never mentioned, whatever the cause, because Bill knew that for us, when he said, whenever we're disturbed, we would think, well, it certainly didn't mean this instance. But he went ahead to further qualify it. No matter the cause, something is wrong with us. And what's wrong is the thinking I'm doing about what's happened. It isn't me that's wrong, it's what I'm doing with what I have that's wrong. So if I have a body that thinks, I am the responsible party for that body, or the responsible essence for that body. Doesn't mean that I am that body. It doesn't mean that I am that brain. It doesn't mean that I am that thought. It means I have those things. And if I'm functioning accurately and honestly, I'm functioning beneficially and usefully, as the book talks about. A lie is not reality. Our brains are designed to process reality. To engage in lying is to engage in insanity as reality and wonder why we end up feeling insane and thinking insane thoughts and doing irrational things over and over and over again, thinking one day they'll be rational. It's not a gimmick and it's not a trick. It's actually using something that we were given, like said earlier, an asset. Imagination is the chance to imagine inspiration. And to imagine inspiration is to begin to realize that inspiration is, in fact, the nature of our existence, the loving, generous, giving, all everything nature of our existence. That inspiration is about spirit. And I have a choice to act on the basis of desperation, which would be a thought struggling to survive, thinking of me as that thought, thinking I am the struggling thing, thinking I have to survive by fighting for that thought, or I will be killed. That I am talking about isn't an I at all. It's simply a delusional idea about thinking of itself. When I am thinking to myself, I'm thinking to my thinking. When I'm thinking about myself, I'm thinking about my thinking. When I begin to see it accurately, I begin to realize it doesn't make a lot of sense to pretend that that's who I am anymore, because I could actually think about my thinking in ways that could be very, very useful and productive. So I unmask the lie by having things as they are and begin to realize they've always been as they are. The only one that was conflicted was me in my experience, the thinking I was doing. And that wasn't me, it's just the choices I made about me, the thoughts I had about me. And when they were sick thoughts, I felt sick things and tended to function on that basis. That's desperation. I'm choosing desperation or inspiration. And if inspiration is an ever essence, I can't lose it. So to start to think of my thinking and my insane ideas about being disconnected and being alone and being apart from and being useless and being absolutely non-existent, all of a sudden that becomes very small compared to this idea that I'm consumed by it and it's everything that exists. Because now I'm looking at that essence as being something that doesn't change. The opposite of the essence of an absolute state is the same as the other. It doesn't change at all, ever. There's no change in it whatsoever. It's hard to grasp, given the mentality that we have, the brains that we have are analytical in their processing. But if we're feeding like a computer bad information, we used to say garbage in, garbage out. It's the information we're providing our thinking. We have one of the most advanced computers on our shoulders in the world, even in comparison to the computers of today. Our head and our brains are still better than those computers. We're not treating them better when we're asking them to try to create reality rather than continue to express an existing reality that never changes. Then the brilliance of inspiration becomes easier to see. And you begin to see that that brilliance, these are terms that we use for intellect, immediately associated to light and brightness. He's bright, she's bright. They're enlightened. It's an elevated state. They're weightless because the light almost weighs nothing. And light is always happening at full speed. There's evidence in our own universe of this absolute nature. Light speed is one of those absolute natures. If we are thinking honestly, we are thinking globally, we are thinking universally, we are thinking absolutely beyond everything, and beginning to notice that when I even consider these things, I start to see that the other things I'm considering have a lot less value to me because it seems stupid to pay so much attention to something that's idiotic. And the stupidity I experience is, by the way, accurate. When I am entertaining ideas that are idiotic, I feel like an idiot. And I think people are all of a sudden thinking of me as an idiot when they look at me, when they talk to me. All of a sudden, my lens of understanding is obstructed by misunderstanding. I'm calling it understanding, but it's misunderstanding that I'm seeing things through. I'm Alice in Wonderland looking through the looking glass, and it's backward, it's upside down. And mirrors, by the way, if you look at an image in a mirror, it's not us, it's a backward image. It's an image. There's no blood, there's no air, there's no life in that. There's just an image. And that image will only remain there as long as you stand in front of the mirror. And that's exactly what we do when we reflect on thoughts, thinking of thoughts, and think about thoughts as the sole source of our existence. We're misusing thoughts, that's all. We are not required. We do not have to. It's an option. And for me to listen to those words that we so often use, I have no other choice, is to ask, why would we use choice when choice always allows not to be chosen, or it wouldn't be a choice? We would call it instinct. We would say it's nothing we can't do, and we wouldn't be thinking of it at all. We'd simply be acting on it. And yet, if we're in the debate, we're trying to rationalize, we're trying to justify, we're trying to come up with some new rational approach to what the basis is irrational. A thought with no basis is a fraction with no denominator. And any number you put on top of it, including infinity, turns to zero, nothing. And non-existence, when I'm trying to make believe I have nothing to do with what's happening, it isn't me. I'm actually fighting for not existing, which is a suicidal ideation. Thinking I need to kill myself to finally be free from this, rather than realize the self I think I'm trying to kill has never even existed other than my thinking about my thinking itself. To talk about this, to listen to this, to consider this, to apply it in consideration by allowing, consideration is not about making a decision. And you may notice that most of the thinking you do that's obsessive is constantly trying to come to the right conclusion. The reason is because it's based on something that's wrong, it's trying to constantly be right. That's a conflict. You can see where inner conflict and mental anguish and emotional turmoil comes from. It's set up in this thinking. I'm going to solve what's unsolvable. I'm going to make possible what's impossible. Your own consideration is an open-ended willingness to live with ideas that may seem completely contrary. And I would suggest to you, when you start looking at this clearly, you're going to see things in your own experience that are very disturbing. But when you are looking at things that are disturbing as disturbed, they will be aligned and they will dissipate as quickly as that dream and nightmare goes away when you wake up and realize, oh, it was only a dream. It's only what we're daydreaming about these things that seem to have them become nightmares. We can dream, and our dreams can be filled with awe and splendor and magnificence. But they can as easily be filled with all the horrors and all the pitfalls and all the shocking difficulties that are caused, that are hard to face, hard to confront. But if we're the makers of them, very different situation than them being some outside force aimed at us. And if that outside force exists, that's a lie, it has no more strength and no more power than the ideas we have at all. It's also, if there is something, it's always been thought of as some anti-life, anti-Christ, anti-experience, anti-God effort. If there is a God, I would say that God certainly wouldn't be defined by the ideas that we have humanized God, that make God something to fear, rather than start to embrace the nature of that existence as being the totality of everything, doesn't include fear. There isn't any of that self-imposed fear in an absolute knowing nature, because there isn't any doubt in that or uncertainty. There's no conflict. There's nothing to fear. Everything that is is. If it's all coming out of the thinking we're doing, and we come to terms with it, the ability to think about things more accurately will be clear, and you'll start to see in your own experience that you've been maintaining ideas that have been very disturbing for a long time. That can be disturbing. Again, as you look at it accurately, if you think your disturbance shouldn't be a disturbance, you're going to set the whole thing up to continue to maintain it. By the way, maintaining something perpetuates it, doesn't dissolve it. Thinking you're going to resist it, deny it, pretend it isn't there, defy it, think of it as something else, maintains it, perpetuates it. That's resistance creating persistence. There's a clarity that I know you know, and it is indisputable, and yet you can dispute it. It's unchangeable, and yet you can think it changes. And again, all those are simply thoughts. And I'm not suggesting you can't or shouldn't have those thoughts. Begin to embrace the thought. If you begin to embrace the thoughts you're having as the thoughts you're having, you may begin to see that you're thinking some pretty sick things, but by seeing the sick things, just like the idea of seeing disturbance as a disturbance, it doesn't put you in any further conflict. You begin to actually embrace what you're doing. As you're doing it, it will dissipate as quickly as the dream goes away again. To wake up and say, oh, it was a dream. Same thing with this, to wake up and see that if it was a nightmare, it's just a horror dream of horror. If it was a good dream, it may have been very convenient, pink cloud, to overcome some other things that have been held in denial and made believed to be buried. My suspicion, my sensation is there is nothing hidden in the universe at all. Everything that is functioning right now exactly as it's functioning. Everything you are doing is impacting everything that is happening. It doesn't mean that impact is so perceptible as for somebody at the other end of the planet to be aware that you just did what you did or are doing what you're doing. But again, we don't need to think in parts and pieces, to think in the total and realize that our experience is the sum total of not only everything that's happening, well, everything that's happening, first of all, which includes everything we're thinking about that's happening. That's the experience we're having right now. We are not alone in it, so we are impacted by all of it. If the impact and influence I'm having on it is creating more and more reactivity, I'm asking for a world that's impossible to solve the problem in, as long as I continue to maintain that reactive, divisive, desperate thinking. This isn't about getting overthinking. It's not about not thinking. It's not about not thinking obsessively any more than in a food program where people have been overeating or trying to bury emotional pain, trauma, whatever it is, and all of a sudden start eating for health rather than trying to fix their problem. In food programs, you don't stop eating. You start eating wisely. You start eating as a form of nutrition rather than a sport, where it's all about taste and texture and flavor and all those things. It's about actual nutrition, which is what eating is actually about. This is about food for thought, where thoughtfulness becomes more apparent than the thoughtlessness of making believe that somehow I'm on an isolated rampage that I'm someday going to sort out in my own mind. And then I can really become the person I've always wanted to be, and everyone will see me that way. When in fact, if we are that thing, if that thing exists, we're already that. That totality is already what we all share. We're just embarrassed about not expressing it. And so we're self-conscious. Interesting word, by the way. Self-conscious is defined as undue regard for appearance. And yesterday on our weekly walk, we talked a little bit about this undue regard, not just for appearance, but undue credit. If I'm thinking thoughts that have no basis, they have no credibility. So what do I look for in doing them? More and more and more of that thing. I'm trying to get money and money and money and money and money. I'm trying to have that thing finally give me credit, have everybody recognize, oh boy, he must really have together. Look at all the money he's got. And yet I still feel empty with all that money because I must need more. I must need more. I must need more. I must need more. Why? Because I'm trying to fill something that will never be filled because it's vacant. It's not just a bottomless pit, as though it's a pit that's without, but it's an absolute lack of essence. It's an absolute lack of substance. It's the ultimate substance abuse, the mental substance abuse, to make believe that something that doesn't exist is so substantive as to require all my attention to be paid toward to it, so I can finally realize it. Everything that's real is already realized. That's what realized is. Real eyes are seeing that. We know that. We are confirmed by it, by the ability to even consider those other things that are said. So I'm going to end off on this note. There's an email if anyone's got any questions or would like to talk directly. I invite anyone to participate in the weekly discussions we have. We're changing it a little bit. We're looking for people who are really sincerely interested, know that they're struggling and they're really interested in helping to begin to engage with other people around this. And this is a public expression, but it's also done anonymously so that we can preserve the traditions of anonymity within any program we talk about. And we can talk about the programs openly as a result and the benefits we've gotten from that for anyone out there who's sitting there not worrying about what they're thinking, but how they're drinking or how they're using drugs or all those other symptomatic behaviors that often seem to be precursors or need to be resolved before we can get to the thinking we're doing, because it was certainly the case for my experience. So anybody who's out there is always welcome to email, and I will respond, and we can talk directly by phone, we can do it by Zoom, etc. I'm happy to be sober. I'm 36 years sober, coming up on 37 on August 8th. I suspect I'll get there because I don't spend my days trying to figure out how to avoid what is happening. I do my best to face it. I'm wrong enough to be able to learn enough, to be able to consider that I may be at the center of the problem I create when I have any problem at all. And there's a lot more to this that we can discuss, and I will do more of these. I think I'm going to start doing some of these and isolate some of the issues that can become a little more declarative about the interactive issues that occur during the day and or thinking things to help give you something to just contemplate, like the idea that opposites are the same. They're really just different positions taken, dispositions, impositions, all that sort of reflect that. If I think my thoughts are real, I think my position is the only one that can be taken, and as all of a sudden everybody else becomes opposed, which really opposition is just different positions. All of a sudden, when I see everybody has the right to think what they want, pretty easy to let people think what they want. I don't care what they think about me as much, because I know what they're doing is just thinking. They're not thinking any more correctly when they're thinking about what they're thinking than I was thinking correctly when I thought my thinking was reality. So it sort of takes the pressure out, the seeming matter out of it. Think about the word matter. The things we think matter most seem to be the heaviest weights we bear. Well, in the universe, matter weighs something. It occupies space. It blocks light. So this discussion has a lot of legs. I love being in it, and I love the friends who come and talk, and we get into this and sort of opens doors and really presents challenges, because I don't think we've talked openly about life. I don't think we face death honestly. I don't think we think of God as anything other than another human for the most part. Very humanistic characteristics, and have been dispirited as humans as a result of that kind of thinking. We've literally created a God that we think is a man, that we think doesn't live here, isn't here. We got to go get him. We got to find him. He's missing otherwise. We need to search for him. He's punitive. If I don't, it's really Santa Claus. You know, it's my experience. Santa Claus in a toga on a cloud. Punishes me when I'm not good. I have to beg for forgiveness. I have to beg for mercy to get out of a jam. I'm the one that creates the jams. And every one of the steps, when I get ready and willing, somehow or another, God seems to be taking away what I am no longer creating. If that infinite source is infinite, we are already absolutely in the know, in a way that's so far beyond what we could think that it seems preposterous to even say that and think that. But if in fact there's an infinite source, how could it be any less than infinite for everything and everyone, everywhere? That includes you, because it includes us. And when I say us, I mean everybody. not just some bodies, and those who have passed, whatever the essence of that passing is. If we call their bodies the remains, there's obviously something that's beyond that body, just like there's something beyond the thoughts we have. And to begin to see the limits of our thoughts are the beginning of everything else is a huge transition to thinking the limits of our thoughts are all that we are and the only thing we have and all we can do to defend against anything else. My love, my appreciation for you listening, for you being there, for your interest, your participation today, all that you've done in your thinking, all that you've done to postpone or like in the set aside part is set aside what you've been thinking just to consider something else. And if the basis of this is accurate, you already know it. You simply haven't been thinking you do. And what I've learned in my experience with others talking about it is their perspective has given me the perspective that I used to say to them, fuck you, to have, because I would be angry for them revealing the aspects of me they didn't want to admit were mine, my doing. And then say, I love you, I appreciate it, thank you. You gave me a chance to actually look at this thing I'm doing because I thought it was you. I begin to see that it's actually me causing it to begin with. Doesn't mean they're not doing something, but it means that my responsibility is what I am responsible for when it comes to my human experience. And if I'm giving them any chance to be responsible, it's not going to come from hyper-reactivity and manic obsessive ideas about what they should be correcting and fixing. So between us, this job we can do anonymously, since you're listening there on a set of headphones or a car or wherever you are. There's no competition for your ears, except what you do with what you hear. So I look forward to further dialogue. Be well.